Here we go. Okay, so welcome everybody to the Springbank Virtual Malts Festival. This is Springbank's night, and with me here we have Ranald Watson, our Group Director of Sales and Marketing, and Findlay Ross, who is Director of Production. So tonight, if you've seen our posts on social media this week, we've been really looking for your input because we wanted to make tonight a wee bit different, to make it much more interactive and audience-led. So all of your questions are entitled to that. So we have lots of questions, and I'm sure that even throughout the evening you'll be able to pop them into the comments box, and if we have time we will be going through those as well. But we have a lot of content, and I'm sure that we could talk just about all night, so we'll see how we go on. So before we start that, we've got 6 drams to try. Hopefully lots of you at home have got those to enjoy as well. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those, and the questions that we have will maybe surround what whisky that we're trying as well at the time. So without further ado, the first whisky that we have is the Springbank 12 cask strength. That was released today, so that was on sale in the UK and parts of Europe from 10 o'clock this morning. Hopefully some of you have got yourselves a bottle of that. And the first question that we actually had from Alex Reich, I think, was when is the Springbank 12 cask strength on sale? So, or when's it coming out? So earlier today.
If you've not got it, then now you might have missed it. in some UK shop.
There we go. So that's the first question. Thanks for sending that in.
That was easy, I hope.
Yeah, I know. Well, they're not all as easy as that. So the second question that we have is quite a nice one to get us started, quite light. What would the best Springbank be that you'd recommend for someone that's starting to drink whisky or is new to Springbank perhaps?
Well, Springbank, as pretty much everybody watching, I'm sure, will be aware, is quite a, it's a very definitive or unique style of whisky. It's got a little bit of peat, a bit of salt, some brine, a lot of fruitiness, sweetness. It's really got layers and depth of flavour. And I find that out of our entire range of whiskies, Springbank 10 or 12, give or take, is probably most representative of the natural style of the spirit. It's representative of the distillery. It's what we distill. It's salty, briny, quite flavour forward, quite punchy, robust. And sometimes people don't immediately take to that. Sometimes people do. And like this dram, for example, it's a big bold dram. Okay, this is cask strength, 10-year-old at 46%. But people can take to it or not take to it in the first go with the 10 and the 12. I often find our 15-year-old. It's 46%. It's 100% sherry cask matured, mixture of first and refill sherry. Still has that Springbank character, but the sherry cask influence kind of tones down a little bit, the more kind of wilder elements of our spirit.
It's got more of a sweetness, hasn't it?
It's quite and the sherry cask influence, I think, is maybe more akin to other distilleries that people might have experienced. So if you like a nice sherry matured whiskey, then the 15 might be an easier way into Springbank than going straight to the 10 or the 12. But it's horses for courses. But I think for me, anyway, 15 is a good place to start.
And another question about this new release of the 12-year-old was about the maturation of it in this edition. So the question was, would the maturation composition, is it the new release, is it a one-off, or are we planning on making it a bit different in the future? It's normally bourbon and sherry matured, but this one included a little bit of port and also some Burgundy wine cask influence as well. So I think that's probably best suited to you, Findlay.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, to a greater or lesser degree, the 12-year-old's composition is always a one-off. It's almost impossible to hit exactly the same cask ratio every time we do it. Generally speaking, I'll try and keep it to bourbon and sherry as much as possible. I think we were chatting a little bit about it earlier, and it's almost an inverse, if you will, of the 10-year-old, in terms of flipping the bourbon and the sherry ratio. I guess the thing to say about this one is that almost certainly a one-off in that the parcel of casks that have been available from this year were unique in comparison to other years. And that's just one of the things that you deal with and live with as a legacy. You're constantly working with the decisions and the filling recipes that have been done previous to you, like in 10, 15 years. We'll be looking back at the things that we fill today and having to make decisions based on that. What I would say is that the quality of the spirit that has been made over the years, and particularly, going back 12, 15, 20 years, is so high that with regards to the cask ratios and how we play around with it, generally speaking, I've found that you really have to go something to go wrong with it. And not that I've been trying to do that, but you really have to go some way to make a mess of what's been left in terms of the quality of the spirit and the casks that have been used. So when we had a look at this one, I really liked the idea of including some of the Burgundy.
It does have we did in the tasting notes kind of pick up on some influences from the Burgundy coming through as well, like a little bit of the sort of tannin towards the end, and
I think
kind of richer flavours.
Absolutely, and the Springbank Burgundy that was released, I'm trying to think here, a few years ago now.
Probably longer ago than you'd care to remember, but care to admit, the time's flying. But yeah,
but I do remember
12-year-old.
that being one of my favourite Springbanks, and just the combination of the spirit and the cask working so well that I was quite happy actually when I had a look at the parcel of cask we had from this year and saw there was some refill Burgundy in there. So to come back to answer the actual question, yes, it's a one-off. I'm very happy with it. I think it works really well. Ultimately, we'll always try and stick to some kind of sherry and bourbon combination, but we are very open to trying slightly different things as long as they work.
Someone did ask as well, actually, Alexander Lan, where did your Burgundy casks come from?
Burgundy.
Yeah,
that might be as exact an answer as anybody can supply.
Yeah, it predates me by quite some time, and the production records are really, really good and they're thorough and they cover everything they need to, but in terms of the actual detail about the specifics of casks and where they came from, they weren't always the best going back in time. We try to be a little bit more specific now. So.
I think, not to try and be fair to Findlay's predecessor, Frank McCarty, who most people will know, will have heard of, but Frank's of the generation of whiskey people who took the responsibility to provide a quality dram extremely seriously, took the curiosity of whiskey fans a bit less seriously. So in terms of, it's from this winery or it's this type of wood or whatever, we don't have records going back to those days. We're lucky we know it's Burgundy and not just red wine, to be completely honest, because the approach from guys like Frank and people who've been in the whiskey industry forever isn't necessarily to reveal all the information, it's just to give you something good.
It tastes good.
We're a bit more aware, I think, or not, maybe not aware, but a bit
it's
more cognizant.
It's more of a new thing, wasn't it? This traceability idea, and exactly.
And I'm all for it, not least because if you want to know the provenance of your wine casks, your port casks, well, the best way to do that is to go and visit. So if we get to go and visit France or Portugal, then traceability is amazing.
And someone did ask what was it, 5% port, that's in the comments there, and that's right, it was 25% Burgundy influence and 5% port, and then the bourbon and sherry for the rest of it. So another question about the or how do you choose your whiskies? Again, it's one of those ones that's going to be quite nice to start off with, and something that Findlay probably does pretty regularly in your job day to day is choosing casks to put together these bottlings. So how do you go about choosing the best barrels? Do you kind of get a nose for it? You kind of get a sense for it that's becomes sort of easier, or do you actually have to taste every one? Or
if I tasted every one, I wouldn't be long in the job. I don't think there's a lot of casks to work through, and even as a relatively small producer and distributor of whiskey, there's still hundreds of casks going to some of our bigger vatins. So with regards to something like the 10-year-old, which is a bourbon and sherry mix, we know from experience and how we do things here that the spirit is really, really good. We know from years of working with our suppliers that the bourbon and sherry cask give us particular influences. So generally speaking, I don't feel the need to taste 326 different casks or whatever it is for that.
You know that's going to go down in history now. There's 326 casks in every batch of Springbank 10. In reality, it's a good bit less than that per batch, but just to be clear, it's not specifically 326 casks every time.
But for something like this, particularly maybe one-off recipes or limited edition products, we do kind of look at things in a more minute detail. So for the likes of this, I would have asked the guys in the production team to draw samples and to try and build up a representative vatting. I would have had a look at it. As we know, there's no good comes from everything being a one-man band, so I very regularly involve Ranald and the rest of the sales guys as well in any decision-making process. So I'll screen it first, and then once I've got an idea about what I think might work or what I think might be good, I'll expand it out to the rest of the team and we'll have a look at it. So in terms of making sure we're selecting the best, I mean, it sounds like I'm making the job sound as easy as possible, but when you're dealing with such high-quality spirit and high-quality casks, it's very rare that you stumble across anything that's particularly unusable or strange. Sometimes it's more the combination of the casks is finding the right things that work, because you can get 2 or 3 great casks that maybe don't work that well together, and vice versa. You can find 3 that maybe as single casks aren't fantastic, but put together provide you with some really well balanced whiskey.
So it's finding the right recipe.
I think
Absolutely.
when you look at the variety of casks in this one whiskey, and okay, to varying degrees, more sherry, a bit less bourbon, a little bit port, and a little bit of burgundy, and a tiny little bit of port. When Findlay said to me, next batch is going to be this, I was like, what? Are you mental? All these different things, but the proof of the pudding's in the tasting. And I think the Springbank spirit, as Findlay kind of alluded to earlier, works reasonably well with most types of casks because it's not a light, delicate, overly soft spirit. It's quite it speaks for itself. It's a spirit that stands up for itself. So I know from experience of talking to people and doing tastings and whatever it is, there can sometimes be a wariness on red wine casks especially. And I think that's because, first of all, a few years ago, red wine casks were a new thing. And new things in whiskey aren't always immediately appreciated by the whiskey world. But when you've got a spirit that's got a bit of that kind of peatiness, bit of saltiness, it works so well with the tannins in the red wine. You look at our long row reds, and the long row is a slightly more extreme example than the Springbank being a bit more heavily peated. But the robustness of Springbank, the brininess, the maritime character, together with the tannins and the wine works really well. But to get the balance, so you go, right, there's some Springbank from Burgundy, that's really good. So that's the first step. But then you're taking sherry casks, a little bit port casks, and some bourbon, and making it all work is why when Findlay told me we were doing it, I did think, oh, interesting. But,
And do you do like a smaller sort of tasting sample, and then
we'll always try and do a representative vat. I mean, it's particularly, say, with the limited edition stuff or things we're maybe doing for the very first time. For the 16-year-old Kilkerran that was launched today as well is a really good example. We took a representative vatting of that, of pretty much all the casks.
How big is a representative vatting then? How many?
This was 100ml samples.
That's what I had in mind. Then when you were saying about vattings, I was saying maybe it's a bit bigger or something.
No, the 100ml samples put together, and especially for something like that, a new product. And distillery that's got a certain characteristic now and a following and something. We had an idea about what we wanted the 16-year-old Kilkerran to be like. So you have to get those things right. With something like the 10-year-old or even the 15 that's really well established, you've laid down, or other people have laid down the legacy that you're continuing to produce high quality spirit and use top quality casks, and that gives you a reasonable guarantee of success most of the time.
Good. So I hope everyone's enjoying that first dram at home. I will give you information on it. We didn't actually really touch on that at the start, but if you've got the tasting pack at home and you're joining in with the whiskies, the percentage of different casks in the maturation is 45% sherry, 25% bourbon, like Ranald said, 25% burgundy and 5% port, so just a tiny bit of port influence there. It's obviously 12 years old and it's cask strength, which in this edition is 56.1%. So that was released today, and it's an annual. Actually, we do 2 editions every year.
Two a year. What are we talking? 12,000 bottles now per release, roughly. Started off at 9,000 bottles. Stock's not getting brilliant, but there's a wee bit more available, so we do slightly bigger batches to try and keep a few more people happy. But yeah, 2 different batches, and you get quite a lot of batch variation between all of our bottlings, even our core products, just by the very nature of how we make them and how we do it. But with the 12-year-old, we're happy enough for each batch to vary to a degree. I think over time we're likely to move back to the 60 to 70% sherry matured. And sorry, Nathan's just apologising for his phone beeping. But yeah, so we're likely over time to move back to the kind of 60 to 70% Oloroso matured portion of the dram, 30 to 40% bourbon. But as Findlay said, you only work with the stock you've got, the casks that are left. When you work at a distillery, when you're running the production at a distillery that's as small as ours, the production level's relatively low and quite variable over historic years. It's a bit more consistent now, but yeah, you work with what's been left to you, but you still have to have the ability to take such a variety of flavours, influences, characteristics, and turn it into a decent dram. So it's not as easy as Findlay's trying to make out it is. But it's it works way more often than it doesn't.
And it's more the sort of younger casks, isn't it? We like with the 10 and 12-year-old that there is that sort of slighter shortage of stock, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice to think we had an abundance of any kind of stock, but because our production over the years really, until fairly recently, maxed out at about 120,000 litres of alcohol between Springbank, Longrow and Hazelburn, and that was in a really good year. Some years it was 20,000 litres, some years it was in between. So we've always had tight stocks, but in 2008 into 2009 we didn't distill particularly much. The second half of 2008, the first half of 2009, when we had the global financial crisis and barley prices went through the roof, oil prices went through the roof, it wasn't economic for us to be making whiskey at that point. As a small family-owned distillery, we weren't really prepared to go to the bank and borrow money to make whiskey when we had warehouses full of whiskey, relatively full of whiskey anyway. So there's that kind of 2-year period where stock is incredibly tight, and that is the stock that now would be Springbank 10, Springbank 12, Kilkerran 12, Longrow peated, Hazelburn 10. So we're going through a slightly tight period
because of production 10, 12 years ago.
And we've got a plan that allows us to ride that out and make sure we're going to supply as much whiskey as we can. The real, the fun part of it is it's affecting the 10 and 12-year-old now. In 3 years' time, it's going to start affecting the 15-year-old. In 6 years' time, it's going to start affecting the 18-year-old. But the easy way around it, and there's an absolutely straightforward solution, is we just go no age statement with our core Springbank and use the stock as it ages. But I would be willing to bet 99.9% of the people watching this tonight don't want us to do that. And we don't want to do it. We're not driven by profit. We're not driven by the need to make lots of money just for the sake of making money. We're more about the integrity of the whiskies we produce. We love the variety between 10, 12, 15, 18. They're all different whiskies. It's not just a very similar dram aging up. The recipe, the profile, the maturation of all of them is different. So that's how that's how we do it. And so we're prepared to take the hit, essentially, on not having as much whiskey as we'd like in order to preserve the quality and the character of what we do. Not that we could put out a great no age statement Springbank, I have no doubt about it, but I don't think that's what your customers, the Springbank drinkers that we meet here and abroad, it's not what people necessarily want us to do, and we don't have any economic reason to go down that road, so we're not going
to. Bram is asking tonight on the chat if we would sell the 10-year-old marrying strength again. So if we would consider doing that again.
So it's a sales question.
Maybe.
I did bring you and then I was like,
Yeah. No, so I was deliberately taking a drink. I never drink water, but this seemed like an opportune time to try and do it. Not at the moment, because we don't have enough 10-year-old whiskey to satisfy demand for our 46% version,
Yeah.
let alone doing another version. And for anybody who doesn't know, the marrying strength was for a while our version of a distillery exclusive.
Okay.
So it was sold through the Cadenhead shop in Campbelltown as it was at the time. And it was basically the same 10-year-old, but just, prior to or following the casks being vatted, you reduce them down to round about 50% before they go back into the warehouse for 6 months to a year. So the marrying strength was the whiskey from that vatting before we took it down to 46%.
Yeah.
And it was available here for people who came to visit the distillery. You couldn't phone up and order it. It wasn't available anywhere else, which was good and great, and it was interesting. And I think that little bit higher strength gave it a point of difference. Do I think it was massively better? No. Higher strength, so people got more say on how much water they added. But what we will be doing, or we've done a number of things since the marrying strength stopped being available. We've got the cage for in the Cadenhead shop with all the different crazy cask samples and all the rest of it.
That's fun, isn't it, Findlay?
Fun, define fun. So you've got the cage, and whenever COVID decides to allow us to get back to welcoming visitor to the distillery, more normal operations, it's our intention to have a regular distillery exclusive, in that there will always be something available for people who come to visit us that you can't get unless you come visit. The plan at the moment is it will be a different single cask of something. Maybe a Springbank, maybe a Longrow, maybe a Hazelburn. There'll also be a Kilkerran, because Campbelltown's, it's a journey. It's not the ends of the earth by any means. It's only 3 hours from Glasgow. And if you've travelled 8 hours from the US or 24 hours from Australia or New Zealand or 2 hours from Europe, it's not that far to get to Campbelltown. But if you come here, why not have something
special,
something nice that
a
you
reward
can get.
for the journey.
Yeah, exactly. As a thank you for actually not stopping at Kennapraig and just for actually coming to Campbelltown. You deserve the chance to get something.
It's definitely worth it.
So it's not going to be the marrying strength. It's not going to be the marrying strength, but it will be something.
And in fact, that maybe leads on to a question that we got the other night in the Kilkerran tasting, but it wasn't answered sadly at the time. But I would like to go back to it just because I think it's quite a good question. And when I brought it up with the both of you the other day, you had loads of answers that I hadn't even really kind of thought about myself. And that was, why do we reduce to 46%? I think it was in relation to actually the Kilkerran 16-year-old that we released today, but many of our sort of more core expressions are reduced to 46%. So there are both sales and marketing reasons for that, and production, I'm sure. And we could maybe hear a bit. We'll start with you first.
Yeah, well, I mean, from the kind of technical side of it, because we don't chill filter our whiskies, if we were to drop much below 46, we might run into issues with things that are kind of insoluble and not present at that strength, and as we get down towards 40, precipitate out and can kind of make the whiskey cloudy and to some people unappealing.
I'm really glad you gave the non-scientific description of cloudy there, because the words like precipitate and whatever the first one you said, I was like, where's this one?
So from that side of things, if you're bottling at 46% with an unchill filtered product, it gives you a better chance of not having a haze, especially at low temperatures. I personally don't have an issue with it. I think you get a lot more mouthfeel from unchill filtered whiskey, and seeing a whiskey that is slightly cloudy at low temperatures doesn't bother me. But I can understand how people who are perhaps new into whiskey or
we think there's something wrong with that.
Yeah, it maybe looks like some kind of imperfection rather than a natural part of the product. So from that point of view, the kind of production technical part of it, that's why I'm sure there's a sales and marketing of that as well.
There's a sales and marketing answer. It's not a sales and marketing reason. if you like. That's saying we don't bottle it at 46% because it's more sellable, it's more marketable. But at 46%, I'll move on to whiskey number 2 if nobody else has. But if this was at 46%, ignore the fact this one isn't. But at 46%, almost half of what's in there is pure alcohol. That's plenty alcohol. Now I get the reason why people like cask strength whiskey. I completely understand it. The ability to add your own water to it is definitely appealing, and it's what cask strength whiskey is kind of founded on and sold on. Again, I'm also the director of sales and marketing for Caddenheads, so I'm a big advocate of cask strength whiskey and its most natural form and all the rest of it. But if you want to take the argument, or if there is an argument, maybe I'm creating it in my own head, but if there's an argument that the whiskey drinker should decide how much water to add to the whiskey rather than the distiller, fine. But you should also be arguing that we fill every cask straight off the still rather than at 63.5%. But at 46%, there's plenty of alcohol in there, and alcohol hides flavour without a shadow of a doubt. Chemically, scientifically, whatever. Not that I know anything about it, but Findlay told me that alcohol locks in flavour. Alcohol is dominant; it's aggressive. It not locks in flavour. So adding some water dilutes down the alcohol, opens up the other flavours that are in there. And again, I understand the conversation, the argument that the drinker wants to choose that. That's fine. We do a 12-year-old cask strength. We do our limited releases at cask strength. But with the best will in the world, we sell 72,000 bottles of 10-year-old Springbank a year at 46%. We sell 36,000 bottles a year of 15-year-old Springbank at 46%. It's not only people who are super mega interested in whiskey who are buying them. And so
it needs to be approachable.
It needs to be approachable. That's exactly the word. Thank you very much. That is the word I was trying to remember for the last 5 minutes. But it does, cask strength can terrify people. I know people who like whiskey, but they don't. Hopefully, they're not listening to this. But they like a dram, but they don't want to think about it. They don't want to know about it. They don't want the technical aspects of it. They certainly don't want to know my opinion on it. But you go, oh, we bottled this one, it's 56.1%. The answer is, holy moly, that's rocket fuel. More than half of what's in there is pure alcohol. You folk are mental. So, and 46%, to go back to what Findlay said, gives you plenty of alcohol for your money, but gives you the mouthfeel, the oily texture to go with the dram. And so I think 46% is, it's pretty decent. How much more do you want?
So one quick funny one just before we move on to talking about the lovely Springbank 26-year-old. Lee Connor is asking, what beers are you drinking?
Well, Ranald very kindly picked up a couple of them. We're not the BBC, so we can mention brand names.
Oh, we can mention the brand names. Other Californian pale ales are also available.
Yeah, some Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which is easily available from many good retailers within Campbelltown, and it's one of mine and Ranald's favourite beers. We just said there were a couple there, but we have similar tastes in a lot of things. And beer is very much one of them, so we thought it was a really good counterpunch to some of the whiskies we're trying. And I did have a glass of water as well, which is long since diminished.
Here we go. So moving on to the next dram. If you've not already started, we have this lovely kind of, this is our open day edition. So this is the one that we did bottle for the festival bottle for our open, our online malts festival. So it's a 26-year-old. It is bottled at 51.1%.
Cask strength, great. I'm glad we didn't do this at 46%.
Can't touch out that one.
I hope sarcasm comes across well.
And it was, I believe, 2 refill bourbon hogsheads.
Correct.
So this was an exclusive open day bottling. We've got quite a few questions, hot topics actually, surrounding this whiskey. So the first one was from Scotch Savvy on Instagram. He said, and I have condensed the question a little bit.
We've only got so much time.
Findlay was a little bit worried that I was going to take the whole taste and just reading the question. So with Springbank's burgeoning premium status, how do you plan to balance its traditions and ethos with a no fuss, no marketing working museum? Does its comparably small output risk turning Springbank into an unaffordable collectible that is really drunk, but instead risks sitting on shelves of collectors and accumulating dust, rather than being enjoyed by fans that love it? So, Ranald, let's answer this one.
There's many answers to this one. I've answered this question 3 times since Nicole first told me it had been asked, but
In your head?
in my head and out loud and to anybody who'll listen. But I think the idea of Springbank as a premium whiskey and stuff isn't necessarily new. It's new to some people, but Springbank, going back many, many years, has always been, forgive the possible arrogance of this, but Springbank's always been a top shelf whiskey. Our 10-year-old, our 15-year-old used to be the most expensive 10 and 15-year-old whiskies on the market by some distance, because the cost of making them the way we make them is higher than most other distilleries, probably any other distillery, especially not just because of our production methods, but the way we run the whole company. So Springbank's always been a premium whiskey. What has actually happened is a lot of other distilleries have caught up with us in terms of their shelf price. It's certainly on core whiskies like 10 to 15, whatever it may be, possibly more for reasons of marketability rather than on production cost. And I don't, for that reason, I don't feel that what we would consider our core whiskies, Springbank 10, 12, 15, 18, and I say core, that doesn't mean they're available forever in every single shop, because that's not what we're about, but the whiskies that are regularly available, plus the Hazelburn 10, the Long Row Peated, Long Row 18, our Kilkerran 12, our Kilkerran Cask Strength, our Kilkerran 16, I don't think they're in the least bit unreasonably priced. They're probably, in comparison to what some other distilleries charge for similarly aged products, our prices compared to how much it costs us, how much blood, sweat and tears goes into making them, are pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
I'm not saying a bottle of 10-year-old Springbank at 40 quid is cheap. Don't get me wrong, I don't, that's a cheap whiskey is a lot different to that. But for what it is, for the quality you're getting, for the work that goes into making it, floor malting, people over technology, 15 people involved in bottling it, 80 people employed by the company, 40 quid for a bottle of 10 years is not unreasonable, but it's still a premium quality whiskey. Our older expressions, so the whiskies dating back to the early 90s, such as this, do absolutely carry a premium above those of other distilleries. But primarily that's down to availability. We don't have a lot of whiskey left from the early to mid to even the late 90s, because we didn't distill in the 1980s, essentially, maybe here or there, but essentially we didn't distill in the 80s. So when this whiskey loch that was created that closed a lot of distilleries in the 80s, we did small production prior to that.
Right.
So the whiskey we distilled in the 60s and 70s saw the company through the 80s. It saw us into the 90s, but we don't have anything left from those times. So there's not much of this stuff available. So it carries a premium because it's rare. There are other reasons which I suspect there'll be more questions that will lead me to answer them in that regard as well, about why we charge what we charge. But generally, I don't worry about the premiumization too much. If we, what we should really do, based on the volumes of whiskey we have available, we should be charging 2, 3, 4 times what we charge. So although it's expensive, and don't get me wrong, I'm aware that a 21-year-old Springbank, 25-year-old Springbank, 21-year-old Long Row and stuff is not cheap. But compared to what other companies would actually charge you for that, it's reasonable.
Yeah.
And the idea being, as the guy who sets the pricing, like it or not, at least with the pricing we're charging, a group of people could get together and share a bottle. Our 25-year-olds.
Which I think a lot of people actually do.
Yeah.
From what I've heard.
And there's not a lot of our 25-year-olds, we do 1,200 bottles a 25-year-old year. It's not a lot, but if the more of those bottles that go to group shares or clubs or usually tastings, the better. If somebody wants to buy a bottle and keep it all themselves, great. And if 350 quid is their price zone, that's fine. But we try and price it so somebody can buy it and share it, or if it's a 25-year-old at 350 quid and you've got 6 folk who want to put in 60 quid each or whatever it is, I don't know if my maths is working, but great, that's fine, because at least you'll get a sixth of a bottle for your 50 quid and it'll be a really good experience and it'll be a great 25-year-old and it'll be a Springbank. And to properly answer that question, because I just realised I probably haven't, we doubled production 4 years ago. So every year since 2016, we've made twice as much whiskey as we had ever before. So we are producing more in order to be able to try and supply the demand a bit better as time goes on. So once we do our no age statement whiskey, or no age statement Springbank, there's tons of stuff to sell.
So that was that one. We've got another question, which kind of does lead on to that, and I think a lot of what you're talking about probably goes for both, but it's slightly different. So I'll read this one out. It's from Alec Priggs, and he says, we're used. Sorry, I think I actually got that wrong. This is the one I condensed a little bit. We are used to Springbank offering stunning whiskies at an affordable price, generally under £100. However, could you give me an insight into how you come to the cost of £425 for the Springbank Festival bottling? This is out of reach for many whisky fans. Is it just the case that the market will stand it, so why not?
No, it's not just the case that the market will stand it, for some of the reasons that I think I've probably just talked about. Springbank that was distilled in the 1990s undoubtedly carries a premium over and above a premium that would be applied to anything else that we're bottling currently and will probably bottle in the future, primarily because of that low production level, but also because during the 1990s we would sell casks to anybody. Springbank used to supply a private bottling for Tesco. Right. You walk into Tesco and buy Tesco Campbellton malt, and Springbank that was in it. Odd bins used to have cask after cask after cask of Springbank. Private customers, as we all know, used to be able to buy a cask of Springbank. You or I or anyone who had a spare, probably wasn't even that expensive, 400 or 500 quid if you're lucky, used to be able to rock up at the distillery or pick up the phone and say, hey, I want to buy a barrel. Great, how many would you like? What cask type would you like? Come on, And that was all stuff that those running the company in those days had to do to get us through the downtime caused by no production in the 80s, the hard time the company was having. So that stuff stood us in good stead. It kept the company going, paid for production in order to allow us to keep distilling. And great, imagine the chance to own your own cask of Springbank. Great, owning your own cask at any distillery is a pretty nice thing to do. But a cask at Springbank that you maybe bought in, I don't know, what's this, 26 years old, so distilled in 1993, these two hoggies. Great, 1993 I bought my cask of Springbank, that's great. I'm going to keep that till it's 21-year-old, because the old 21-year-old Springbank's really famous, it's really great, that's what I'd like one of them myself. 21 years on, 2014, all of a sudden you realise that cask you paid 450, 500 quid for is now worth more than that almost per litre of alcohol that's in the cask. So the prices jumped like exponentially. I can't even calculate how much that's gone. And because we sold so many and have been bottling whiskey from the 90s throughout the last few years, there's very few of them left. And we like to buy them back from private customers. So someone who did invest in their cask goes, wait a minute, this is worth so much money, I'd like to get some bottles from it, but I don't want all of them. We would like to negotiate and buy all of them back. If you own one, talk to us, we might be able to buy it if you're reasonable. But
Ranald, that.
Yeah, but some folk are a bit more commercial than that. So they may sell their casks on the open market. They realise the value and they go, well, there's a limit, and there is a limit, to what Springbank will pay. I can get more than that from an independent bottler. I can get more than that from someone else. So they put their casks onto the open market. So that means that in order to be competitive on the cost of buying those back, our price has gone through the roof. We're now offering per litre for a private cask distilled in the 90s. We are now offering for some of these casks probably up to 8 times as much as we were previously having to pay for them since over the last 4 or 5 years. More of these casks are appearing. Some people are even auctioning their casks at Springbank. Now that's everybody's right. We'll cover auctions again later, but everybody's right to do what they want with their possession, their cask, whatever it is. But we're trying to compete with that. So we could not compete. We could just let these casks go in the open market where you're never going to see them, or they're going to come out through other companies that'll charge an arm and a leg. So we're now paying huge amounts per litre for these casks compared to what we were, and we're not a charity, So we're paying whatever we pay per litre. You've got your taxes and your alcohols, your duties and everything else that everybody's got to pay. But we're also trying to run a company to support 80 employees. So we can't bottle them and sell them at no margin. We can't buy them and sit on them for loads of years. Some of them we do, but we can't sit on everything we do. So is 425 quid expensive for a 26-year-old Springbank? Yes. Have you seen the prices that some other folk are charging for their 30-year-old whiskies this week? And I get that people who are used to buying their Springbank 25s and 21s, lucky enough to have bought them in the 90s when they were a £5 a bottle or whatever. This seems expensive, and it's undoubtedly expensive, but it's not taking the Michael, it's not ripping the backside out of it, because you can guarantee you're buying this from us, it's not going in someone's pocket. It's paying 80 salaries. It's contributing to one of the biggest employers in Campbelltown, and so I'm comfortable with the price list. Would I like it to be cheaper? Yeah, because then I'd buy a bottle. But it is what it is. We've got to do what we've got to do, and I think we've got to strike that balance between keeping our core range whiskies reasonably affordable, and if the more expensive whiskey, or the older whiskey, sorry, costs us more money to get back to deal with its cost, and it's got to be a bit more expensive. Yeah, fair enough, hands up, it is expensive, but if you can't get a bottle, find a pal, 2 pals, 3 pals, and maybe chip in together and you get a third of the bottle, but it's bloody good. So, it's not 3 times better than a normal whiskey, but it's good.
And good to include in that pack as well. So, I mean, how many packs did we do? It was 400, I think.
Yeah, 400.
So 400 people at home tonight have got the opportunity to try that lovely Springbank 26, which
it is lovely as well.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
great.
A
A chance to showcase
yeah.
on a platform like this is great, because quite often these are the samples that we'll try. When we're looking at assessing older Springbanks or casks that we don't have a huge amount of, we'll get a chance to try it in the office and chat amongst ourselves. But for you guys at home to be able to try this, gives your thoughts on it, an opportunity to buy the bottles as well. And that's really what Springbank's all about, is showcasing how good the whiskey is, and it's fantastic.
I think I remember actually I was doing the sort of group tasting when this one was being chosen for the tasting packs, and everyone was like, oh yeah, that's a good one.
we put a huge amount of work into selecting the casks for this. It was me, Findlay, and Dave Allen, the Springbank sales director. And it was, we weren't long back to work post-COVID, but post-lockdown in the UK, and gathering groups of people indoors to do things like joint cask selection probably was a bit ropey. How do you taste whiskey wearing a mask? So we did it in my back garden, and Findlay brought up a bag of samples in 1993 Springbanks, and we played with loads. First fill sherries, first fill bourbons, refill sherries, all the rest of it. And we identified the casks, and Cameron talked a bit about this last night in Cadenhead tasting. But you identify the casks that you've got, and you go, that's a cracker, that's brilliant, love that one. That one's okay, that one compared to that one isn't as good. And we basically tried loads of individual casks, terrible job, horrible afternoon, sunny and everything, glorious. And we tried all these different casks, identified the ones we liked, tried marrying 1 or 2 or 3 together to come up with what we liked. And like Cameron said last night, it wasn't the 2 best casks married together that gave you the best combination. It was, casks that were really good, but not the top level, because that's
answered one of the questions I was just going to ask you, was why marry 2 26-year-olds? They weren't actually 2 26-year-olds, were they? One was 27.
They weren't, one was 27. Yeah, exactly.
But was that better than one individual cask? But I think it also probably was a factor that we wanted to have so many bottles available.
Well, we could have bought one cask to charge 900 quid. Imagine the comments we could have got from that. It was slightly off topic to a degree, but everything we do is so limited that we don't have enough of any of it. But you like to at least make a stab at trying to let as many people as possible get your whiskey, and that was why we were looking for about 500 bottles or whatever it was. We actually ended up, it's probably less than that. Is it?
400 or something, I think. Yeah.
But we were, bottle everything but the simple cask. Life's easy, but nobody gets anything, so it's not ideal.
So there we go.
But this is gorgeous.
And then one just kind of a more straightforward question at the end. Nagi Sawada on Instagram asked, what is the oldest cask that we have?
Let's look at Ranald here and see if we're willing
Oh,
to
sorry,
know such information.
Divulge.
Well,
Wait till they find out the price of it. No, I'm only joking.
No, as Ranald touched on there, there wasn't a huge amount of production in the 1980s, and the difficult period he was talking about during the 90s would have involved you bottling a lot of stock that predated that. So 1989 is the oldest cask that we've got on site that we own ourselves, which doesn't seem that long ago, but it's a fair whack of years. Yeah, that's the oldest.
So I think time for another dram. And I think people are wondering often what dram it is that we're actually drinking while we're talking, but the truth is we are drinking and talking quite a lot. So I'll introduce them as we go into a new one, like we do. But the one that we are about to start drinking, along with hopefully all of you at home, is the Springbank Madeira Wood.
So number 3 on
Number
your
3.
list.
And this one's 48.5%, and is in fresh Madeira. No, 17-year-old. And this is the one that's been in bourbon and rum casks.
That's right, yeah. It was a bourbon and rum cask vatted, and then we put it into Madeira about 3 years ago. I think the interesting thing about this dram is that, and we touched upon it earlier, somebody asked a question about how do we select casks and how do we monitor them. We tried this probably about a year into it having been in Madeira, and it was a totally different dram, Ranald. I'm sure you'll agree.
Absolutely.
It was much sweeter. There probably wasn't the integration that we're seeing just now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas just as it is at this stage, 3 years in Madeira, I think it's taken maybe a lot more of the cask tannins. It's a little bit drier. It's a lot more balanced than it was then. I absolutely love this. I enjoyed it when it was sweet, but it was just Madeira layering on top of the Springbank.
It's much more Springbank with a cask influence now, rather than a cask poured on top of Springbank. If you can put it that way, like you got all the Madeira, all the sweetness. It was delicious.
Yeah.
But was it the most Springbank ever? No. Because the Springbank in the finish, I thought, was very present. But at first, it was the Madeira, the sweetness, the toffee, the buttery, the tannin kind of thing. Whereas, as Finn says, the balance in this is much more. This is Springbank influenced by Madeira, and I suppose that
that's really the way it should be, isn't it? Like
yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that sweetness that we identified right early on, there would have been a large amount of that sweetness from the rum casks that went into the marriage first.
Right,
And again, that's another pretty bourbon, rum. Okay, we'll marry them together and put them into Madeira. Why? Why not?
And like, do you
Why
just
not?
is this a total like? Do you have past experience of doing that kind of thing, or this is like the first time you've done it, and you're kind of, or you have a good idea of how it's going to sort of turn out anyway?
I think there's kind of two aspects to that. One is that rum cask maturation is so variable as it is because there are loads of different rums out there. They all impart different flavours. I think generally speaking, with regards to rum and Springbank, it's pretty much always worked from my experience of tasting it, and certainly a lot of the kind of rum influenced Springbanks have previously been in bourbon casks when we've done a re-rack or something like that. So I didn't have any huge concerns about bourbon and rum, and I think it was quite heavily in favour of bourbon in terms of the cask ratio. So that little bit of rum didn't concern me too much. I think, and didn't concern me at the time, but Ranald touched on it, was the integration of everything. That 1 year with Madeira, okay, it gave you something totally different from what the kind of base cask ratio was and the base spirit was. But would you necessarily say it showcased the best of Springbank and the best of the dram? I wouldn't have said that at the time, which is why we've allowed it to mature on to this stage. And this is a dram that we have tried pretty frequently. that makes it sound worse than it is. But with something like this, where we know that the changes are going to be quite quick. We know that a year, 18 months, 2 years, you're going to see a big difference. You have to keep an eye on these types of things, and so that's what we've done. And I'm really happy with the way this has turned out, and hopefully everyone at home agrees with that.
Lots of people are asking on the chat, when is this going to be released? So we haven't officially announced that, I don't believe yet.
Let's officially announce it, Nicole. Let's
Do you
do
want to?
it. Let's do it.
Yeah.
When is it?
The actual date?
Yeah, let's do it.
So
Let's send the because the retail world not had enough hassle from us today, launching 3 products this
I
afternoon.
know.
Let's tell them
Actually, when we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, it was planned for like next week, and a couple of us were thinking, we've just done 3, that's quite a lot.
Let's give them an extra week, so it's coming out in 2 weeks.
You were wanting to put your paydays in the same month.
So yeah, 20th of November, so 3 weeks
20th of
today.
November is the planned launch date for Madeira. So this is a pre-release sample that you've got.
It will be bottled at this strength though, yeah?
Yes.
48.5, so it's not, this is cask strength, it's not been reduced. So this will be out. And when we talk about our release dates, we make an effort within the bounds of realism to release whiskies in different countries on the same day. But it's not always possible, shipping times, size of our distributors, how many different orders they have to try and collate together and stuff. So when we talk about specific release dates, we can only really ever guarantee that in a Cadenhead shop, be that Cadenhead's Campbelltown, Cadenhead's London, Cadenhead's Edinburgh. Ideally, Cadenhead's in Europe, but that doesn't always happen. But sometimes it can be in Cologne, Berlin, all these places, Odense, Baden, Vienna. Which Cadenhead shop am I going to get in trouble for forgetting? Milan. It can hopefully be in those shops at the same release date, but it's not always possible to have it in every country in the world at the same time. So when we say a definite release date, we pretty much mean Cadenhead's, Campbelltown, London and Edinburgh. It will be available in those dates. Generally, it's available through the main UK retailers those dates, and the rest of the UK, if not on that day, which it often is, but if not that day, within a few days following that. So yeah, you've got 3 weeks to save up for this after spending all your pennies on us today. Blame Brexit and COVID and any other excuse that you want to think of.
So the next question's probably quite relevant to this because it's a bit more of an unusual cask type maybe. We've got 3/4 people asking something similar. So Johannes enjoys whiskey on Instagram, Dan Ruel, and Taz Whis on Twitter are all kind of asking if we plan any more unusual cask type maturations or to make our whiskey creations. And more specifically, Lucy Allen was asking if we plan to use Calvados casks in the future, or have we?
We certainly have done in the past. I think with regards to unusual cask types, I'm guessing when we're talking about unusual cask types, we're
are there any that we haven't tried that we are thinking of trying?
I can't think of anything immediately.
I don't know if there's anything we haven't tried that we're thinking of.
No.
There are, the recent changes.
So the reason you haven't tried the ones you haven't tried is because you don't want to try
If
them.
we'd wanted to try them, we would have tried them, I think.
Yeah.
And I'll take the flak for this rather than Findlay. But we try things that we think will work. We don't just try things because we're allowed to. So the recent changes to the legislation about maturation Scotch whisky, which meant that your casks didn't only have to contain whisky alcohol that was made from fruit or grains, and opened it up to stone fruits and all the rest of the other things. And tequila was the one that got the headlines. We didn't want to mature our whisky in tequila casks because I'm not. I don't see it myself. But we've been using a multitude of cask types forever. Going back.
Is that because of the relationship with Cadenheads?
It's a contributor, absolutely, especially in terms of rum casks, as Findlay mentioned, that we know Springbank and rum casks works very well. That's because through Cadenheads, we've been emptying rum casks since the 1970s. And what do you do as a whisky company with an empty cask? Well, you fill it. So we've been filling rum casks, and we're not afraid to experiment, and Lucy Allen's question about Calvados is a great one because up until recently, apparently Calvados was forbidden. You shouldn't use Calvados casks. So we bought the 12-year-old Springbank from Calvados 7 years ago, which means 19 years ago we filled, well, it was a 12-year-old, 6 years in bourbon, 6 years in Calvados. So 13 years ago we filled Calvados casks because there was nothing that specifically said you couldn't.
Right.
So we don't like to wait until somebody tells us we can do something.
Yeah.
We'll do it when
Why not
we
do it?
want
And
to do
then
it.
when you release it, and or when it becomes something that everybody's starting to fill, you're like, oh, we've already got one that's like 15 years old.
There is that slightly cantankerous element to our
definitely
approach,
but-
but you also have the situation where, and it's not common knowledge, but it is public knowledge, that a few years ago we started experimenting with non-oak
I was
cask
going to
types.
ask, should I?
Absolutely,
Right.
let's do it.
Sure.
Let's have it.
Anyone who's been down to Campbelltown and perhaps been on one of our the old Premier Tour, I can't remember the name of it off my head now, but
Barley to bottle.
well, no, there's nothing like that. Yeah, anyone who's been in and had a
We
draft.
too walking in warehouse tour. That's why I can't remember it because it's a large title.
Yeah, if you've been in Warehouse 3, that is where we tend to keep a lot of individual casks and also experimental stuff for two reasons. One, it's a dunnage warehouse, it's small, there's easy access to the casks. Two, it's right behind my office and I'm a very lazy man, so I just like to walk round the corner if I need to check on anything. But the tastings that we've hosted in there, invariably someone will spy this very fresh looking cask in the back of the stove and say, oh, well, what's that? And as Ranald says, we've tried different wood types. So in the last, it was 3 years ago we did it. We filled some acacia, filled some chestnut, we filled some cherry wood, purely out of interest, just to see, how it would mature, what it would be like, how it would compare to whiskies matured in bourbon casks and sherry casks of a similar age. I don't want to draw any conclusions on that because it's something that we're monitoring all the time. But I think in terms of
That means it's not going well.
in terms of the strangest thing we've done recently, that's probably up there. Doing something that is not oak, cannot be called whiskey out the back of it, is one of the oddest. Kind of pulling back from that, I think as Ranald mentioned, we are quite careful about what we fill. We do fill other cask types, not just bourbon and sherry. But generally speaking, we got a lot of experience about what works and what doesn't. So from my perspective, I like to maybe see if we can get a hold of kind of niche casks that are within a sort of range that we already know. So like we know that Sauterne has worked really, really well with all of our whiskies in the past. If we can get some sweet fortified wines that are from smaller regions of different names with slightly different characteristics, I would love to be what we do, to fill them and see what they're like as they progress. I don't want to go too crazy with anything because, as we've touched on before in previous answers, we don't have an endless supply of whiskey. We have increased production, but it doesn't allow us to just go, right, let's just get every single cask type we can get our hands on and fill it. There has to be that balance between fulfilling recipes, maintaining a great quality whiskey, and experimentation. And it's a balance that we're constantly striving to get right.
That's a good point. I'll try and remember that when I've got loads of stupid ideas about what we might do or might not do or whatever. That is actually the point. You don't want to take away, when you're dealing with limited distillation runs, limited spirit production, you don't want to take away from that core need that everybody likes and that we love to experiment. But it would be foolish to not experiment. I mean, we have two distilleries. We've not really talked about Kilkerran and Glengyle yet, but we've started to develop Kilkerran into a distillery that everybody loves. But we've got years and years of history of using different cask types to see what it does to the whiskey. So we know very, very well what it does. So our experiments, not so much at Springbank, in fact, not at all at Springbank, but don't confuse it, but not at all at Springbank, but with Glengyle Distillery, our experiments are not how you mature it, it's how do you make it. Heating levels, distillation processes, fermentation times, that kind of stuff is where our experimentation as a company, a group of companies, is going to go. We know what makes Springbank great. We know what makes Longborough great. We know what makes Hazelburn great. Yeah, we'll try something different every now and again. But our real experimentation is at Glengyle with production methods and production styles and that kind of stuff. In relation to and I'll try to tell this really quickly. But in relation to the non-oak cask types, the acacia, the cherry, that kind of stuff, it was really interesting. We filled them, we took pictures of them being filled, we put it on social media. Fine, it's all right. We make whiskey, we make spirit, we do what we want with it. Within a few days of those posts, those pictures appearing on social media, we got a letter from our best pals at the Scotch Whisky Association, demanding, no less than demanding, to know what we were going to do with the spirit that went into those casks. Because obviously you can't call it Scotch whisky, because Scotch whisky has to be matured in oak. It has to do with it. So we're not stupid. We know the rules about making Scotch whisky. We also know that we're an independent company doing what we do, and it's absolutely none of their business what we fill into casks. It may be their business. You can argue, is it their business what we bottle? It's not their business what we bottle until we stick the words single malt Scotch whisky or blended Scotch whisky on the label. So they wrote us this letter demanding to know what our plan was, and you should not call it, you should not be doing that and stuff. And it's like, well, we had about 7 different responses to their letter that had 10. I took swear words out of most of them, but it was, get lost. What's it got to do with you? We'll do what we want, but that kind of stuff. And eventually the response that went back, which actually was composed by our chairman rather than me, which is probably a good thing, was dear person who wrote the letter, I can't remember his name. Thank you for your, as a company of almost 200 years standing in the Scotch whisky industry, we are well aware of the rules and regulations governing the production of single malt Scotch whisky. Thank you for your interest in our company. And that was it. And I think
Did you get a
that's fair
response?
enough. No, that was it.
So how many casks actually did you fill? Was it one of acacia, one of...
No, there was a parcel, and we actually put different spirit types into it as well. So although I'm really struggling to remember even 3 years back, which is terrible, but it was a parcel of casks, and we put some Springbank into it, and we also put some Kilkerran into it as well as a comparison to run beside. But it's not as if we're expecting some long-term range to come out the back of that. It was purely interest, both equally and just general interest about, okay, oak is the wood type that whiskey must mature in, but what happened to be something different?
And do other industries use like acacia and cherry wood and...
The acacia we actually got from a cognac supplier.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't claim to be any kind of expert on anything, to be honest, but particularly not spirit types that I'm not in charge of. That came from a cognac producer who we got put in touch with.
And then a nice sort of question just to round that off would be from Rian van der Weeden, and he was wondering what is Findlay's favourite cask? Is there one that you sample a wee bit more often on a Friday afternoon in those infamous sampling sessions that you do every Friday?
Every Friday.
Well, the gentleman asking the question know very well. He was in the whisky school a few years ago, and his football team had a good result last night, so I'm sure his dram tastes all the sweeter today. I don't know where this rumour has come from that kind of Friday afternoon comes around and I lock the door and there's drams poured. And
it's because the whisky scholars think that when they graduate at between 12 and 1 o'clock that you spend the rest of the afternoon drinking because you're so thankful that they've left.
Well, whoever it is, they need to stop looking in the window on a Friday afternoon. It's a funny one because for the most part, as in a professional capacity, when we're tasting for a reason. We're looking to assess something or find out something. But as I touched upon, warehouse number 3 quite often houses a lot of our more unique casks. Because they're so easily accessible in there, that tends to be where we put whiskies that we want to delve into. So there's a few that have been in there over the years. One actually we tried earlier in the week in the Hazelburn tasting, which is the 1998 Hazelburn in warehouse number 3, which to my money is one of the best whiskies on site. I've struggled to find anything that really matches it. As an example of an amazing single cask, it is right up there. Just across from it, for a long period, there was an old Springbank and an old Longrow that were part of the Barley to Bottle tour. And the Longrow of that, I think it was 1994 Longrow, was absolutely superb. It was one of my favourite whiskies.
It's like the golden triangle of warehouse.
It was so easy. You know, I said I'm a lazy man. They were stouts across from each other. I didn't have to move anywhere. But I think Cameron McGeehey touched on it last night in the Casks tasting. It was actually the Casks. The Casks recently bottled. And I'd just like to clarify that it wasn't because I'm a cheapskate. I just could not get a hold of a bottle of this. So I'll remember that next time I'm paying for Cameron's range balls out of the golf course. Go get a cheapskate last night. But no, that is one of my absolute favourites. So those two in warehouse number 3.
And if you joined the Hazelburn tasting, that was the one that was in the pack, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
That's
so
right.
joined, and actually I joined in that tasting myself at home, and this is a cask that everyone raves about here. David Allen, it's his favourite cask, and I'm sure I've been in a tasting tour when I first started with the Stallions that came down end of last year, beginning of last year.
January this year.
And we tried it, I'm sure, as well. But it wasn't until I tried it the other night in my house while listening to the virtual tasting, I was like, oh wow, I had like the epiphany.
Glorious.
I was like, that is amazing.
that is my favourite cask in the whole distillery.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, you know, Hazelburn it's not the most underappreciated. Well, it probably is the least appreciated of the 3 drams, the 3 whiskies that we produce. But that bourbon influence, that length of time, and that's been a great cask for 3 or 4 years, to the point where it's probably nearly empty, because every time we go in there we're like, try this, let's try this. That's why when Findlay doesn't give us keys to the warehouse, you know, it's like we have to ask for the key because he knows everything. That, at least every time I go in, it's like, yeah, we're going to go straight into that Hazelburn. But yeah, it's glorious.
And what about yourself, Ranald? So that maybe answers the question.
Yeah,
What's your
absolutely.
favourite cask?
Absolutely.
Is
That one
same
is for me is great.
I think that's everyone's favourite then, isn't it?
It's funny, isn't it? Because, you know, like,
because David proclaimed it was his favourite the other night as well.
I think it would be an interesting thing to do. I mean, you can't have a sample of all of them. There's 14,000 up, 15, 16, 17, 17. Wow, man, we've been doubling production for 4 years. But yes, 17,000 casks, so you kind of know them all, but you know the majority of the ones that are above a certain age, and that goes for Kenheads as well. You know, we're not averse to trying some samples. And so you identify the stuff that you need to keep an eye on pretty early, whether it's in the Madeira, Springbank or older stuff, because you don't want it falling below strength, you don't want it getting overaged. You know, somebody asked me once, you know, how do you know when a cask is perfect? Well, you will never know when a cask is perfect until it's not perfect anymore. Because cask, you know, maturation profiles, whether it's age, regardless, maturation profiles go like that, and then they go like that. So you never know when it was at its peak until it's no longer at its peak. So I reckon that Hazelburn 98 is getting close to bottling, but I'm not going to speculate in a public forum. Absolutely. So, but I'm not going to speculate in a public forum such as this as to how we may choose to bottle it, because I know that's going to spark the whole chat.
Rian agrees that's the best.
Yeah. And the thing I love about it the most is I've been here 5 years now, and it was amazing 5 years ago, and it's continued to get better. And as Ram touched upon, you'll never know the absolute apex, but it's improved every single year.
Okay, so I think it's time for another dram as well. So we're going to move on to another core product in the range, the Springbank 21-year-old. This is matured 30% in bourbon, 30% in rum, 25% Oloroso and 15% port, and it is 46% strength.
My favourite thing, well not my favourite thing about this, because my favourite thing is the nose probably and then the palate, but somebody said to me when they saw the cask makeup of this, they went, you know, Frank never used to use such a strange array of cask types. And I said, Frank just never told us what array of cask types he used. But it is another one where there is quite a range of flavours, different influences on this. It's so interesting on the nose.
And this is definitely one of these ones where we took representative individual cask samples, checked the vat and had a discussion about it, because as Ranald touched upon, you know, I'm aware that this is a reasonably out there selection of casks to put together, especially for a 21-year-old whiskey. But again, much like the 12-year-old, I felt as soon as I put it together that it was something that was going to work. But as I also mentioned before, you can't be a one-man band, and certainly in a company like Springbank. So to get other people's opinions and thoughts on it was key. But I think this works fantastically well. As Ranald touched upon, the nose is probably one of the most alluring noses on a whiskey that we've tried in a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's lovely. It's got depth, it's got character, it's got enough Springbank about it.
Well, I was just going to say that's going to lead me on to a question, because
You think we talked about these in advance?
in our tasting session, I suppose this is a question really actually from me. Let's say I've got a question for you. One of the things that came up was that people thought this was had a sort of old style Springbank characteristic about it. And I just wanted to know, as a relatively new person to the team, like, what does that mean? Like, what is it that makes the Springbank have this sort of older style that's different to how they are now? And then this I did ask this the other day, and then it opened a huge can of worms about like how the whiskies before we were different maturations and things like that, and bottled as a 21-year-old. So loads of different things came out, which was really interesting. So yeah.
What was the question?
What does old style Springbank, how do they differ? Like when people talk about this old style Springbank versus how it is today, the 21, you said that was quite a good example.
Yeah, the old 21 versus new 21.
Mm-hmm.
Good time to ask it. There are things within production of whiskey that you can control, and there are things that you can't control. So you can control your distillation, you can control to a degree your fermentation, though your yeast may vary depending on what's available. You can control your timings, you can control, whether you choose to use a computer to do your cut points for you, or whether you choose to use people. And I'm sure everybody watching knows we choose the least technological aspect of all of that. You can't massively control your barley.
Mm-hmm.
You can't massively control your casks because you're beholden to the people who supply them to you, and sherry casks have changed over the years. You're not allowed to add Paxarette to your casks anymore. You don't use sulfur candles, all that kind of stuff. So the middle bit is the bit we control. The distillation of the spirit, as far as we can control it, isn't massively different to what it was back then. And I think back then probably refers to the 60s and 70s, because when people talk about old Springbank, they mean the old Springbank bottled early 90s, late 90s that was distilled in those days. I think there were some absolutely phenomenal Springbanks distilled in those days and bottled in the 90s, without a shadow of a doubt. The first Springbank 21s, the old 12-year-old 100 proof double darks, all these things, were phenomenal whiskies. Were they as Springbank as the Springbanks we're bottling now? As in, did they reflect the character of the new make as much?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't think they did, but that doesn't lessen their quality as whiskey, and they were the whiskies that helped put Springbank on the map and led us to where we are today. But they owed so much to their maturation, whether it was the cask type or the length of time in the cask. So the 21, as you say, is a good example, because there are Springbank 21s bottled in the 90s, the early part of the 2000s, that the 21-year-old whiskey was the young component in that dram. So those bottles, those whiskies contained whiskey that had been matured for up to 37 years. Because in those days, having had this fallow production period, when the whiskey industry crashed essentially in the 80s, started to pick up in the 90s, moved on. Springbank had no whiskey from the 80s. They didn't have 10 and 12-year-old whiskey or an abundance of 10 and 12-year-old whiskey. They had no 14 to 20-year-old whiskey, so there was a massive gap in stock. So the guys at those times took everything 21 and above and married it together and called it Springbank 21.
Mm-hmm.
So there was whiskey in there up to 37 years old.
But that was in the to strive to sort of get core products.
Yeah, to have enough of an identifiable product, core product, if you like, as it's known, to sell. The rest of the whiskey went into Springbank CV, German's VAT, which is another tremendous whiskey.
Yeah, I know, I'll try that.
Brilliant stuff. So they had two brilliant whiskies, but neither of the CV was it must have been one of the first, not one of the first no age statements, because single malt used to be sold without an age statement, but it was the first Springbank no age statement. And then they had this really old stuff that some of it was 21, lots of it was much older than that. And you had two tremendous whiskies from that. But I think if people are comparing this one to old style Springbank, I think we've hit a real sweet spot here, because to me this has got brine, a little bit of peat, just a tiny little bit of peat in the finish. It's got the hallmarks of what I would consider a modern day Springbank, but if it reminds people of old school Springbank, then even better, because that old school Springbank 21 was much older than 21. So if we've hit upon a 21-year-old that reminds people of that, then I think we've surpassed our own expectations with that.
And then there were quite a few questions, as you can probably imagine, around age statements and our plans for the future. So we had Stephen Hawkes on Instagram, C. Crokin, I think. Instagram names are funny, but and Ronnie Grant as well. They were all interested more in if we have plans to release a 30 or even a 35-year-old in the future.
Did somebody lined these questions up? We've got a 30-year-old coming out next year, and I'm not sure we've talked publicly about that before.
No, we haven't. See, I was thinking, I know that we are, but I hadn't heard anyone speaking about it.
When do the whiskey we need to use for the 30-year-old turn 30, Findlay? What's the bond date? Roughly. I mean, I know that you told me yesterday, but
There's some 1990 and 1991 stock, so it'll be some point in next year.
So I think it turns age 2021, and it might be into 20. It's late in the year, I think. November, December.
I think with the distillation schedule worked back then, there was a lot of stuff at the tail end of the year.
Within the next 14, 15, 16 months, we're going to release a 30-year-old Springbank, and that will be an annual release. 30-year-old. Once we've bottled it, we will keep bottling it. So that's pretty exciting. And in terms of a 35-year-old, the parcel of casks that the festival bottle or the open day bottle that we tried, whenever it was, came from the 1993 parcel. We've got more casks from 93 than any other year in the 1990s, and we a few years ago decided to keep a few of those back so that in 2028, which is the 200th anniversary of the founding of the company, basically, we're going to do a special 35-year-old in 2028 as the 200th anniversary bottling.
So both of those.
Both are coming. Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of funny that the 30-year-old's coming in 2022. And then the 35-year-old's coming 6 years later, but that's life. That's Springbank.
That's it. So yeah, that was a pretty enjoyable dram, that one.
It's lovely.
So the next thing we're going to move on to another dram, I think, which is the local barley edition. Now this one is dram number 5, but we've got quite a lot of questions surrounding local barley. So there's quite a lot of things to cover, I think. So the edition that we have here is a preview of the next release, which will be out. In fact, that answers one of the questions, I think. Bram asked when will the next edition of local barley be released, and that is planned for March 2021. And then we did have another question from someone on Instagram, Springbank 2433, and he had heard that it was going to be fully matured in Oloroso sherry casks. That's the rumour. Is that true? And yes, that is true. So this is a Springbank matured in sherry Oloroso, which is that the first in the sort of series that we've done?
First fully matured in Oloroso. Generally speaking, when it comes to local barley, the component that changes is the barley aspect. In terms of what we do with the barley, how we mash it, how we distill it, the cask types that we put it into, that very closely follows what we would do with just normal Springbank, the Springbank that we use our bought-in malt for. Sorry, bought-in barley. That's very controversial there.
Whoa! Don't tell them that. This is recorded. And watch it again.
And again and again
We
and again.
don't buy in malt at
No.
Springbank.
So the cask types generally follow the same kind of recipe, and what that leads to is a generally consistent recipe for each of the local barleys we've released so far.
But they're all new, by the way. So this is all of the range. Not all of them, but as of recent history, there was a 5-part series planned.
If you buy all 5, you get a free lamp. You don't really. We don't.
Available at IKEA. So we've got this 5-part series here, but this is going to be the 6th, which is causing major confusion amongst everybody online, it appears. And the reason is, I'm guessing, because it's been popular, it's worked well, you want to continue that?
Yeah, and we had a bit more whiskey available than we thought we had, to be honest. It's probably the easiest explanation.
So it's going to continue as an annual?
Yeah, it's going to continue as an annual for the foreseeable. We produce it every year, so why not bottle it every year? And I think, as Findlay mentioned, that there is a point of difference every time. So either a different farm or a different strain of barley.
All in the Kintyre area?
All local, absolutely.
How far away? What's the furthest away farm that we've used? Is it all within a sort of 10 mile radius?
Oh, less. Well, no, sorry. I was going to say less. South End's probably about 10 miles away, but we've gone from probably 3 miles north of Campbelltown to about 10 miles, at the most, maybe 8 miles south.
Yeah.
So it's all within a 12-mile diameter, never mind radius, 6-mile radius, if you want to get mathematical. But, and somebody will tell me that was wrong. But yeah, as close, it's Campbelltown. Basically, Campbelltown, South Kintyre, South End, Macrahanish, Drumline, Sturn, whatever. But yeah, it's we made the whiskey. There's a difference. Local barley makes a difference.
Yeah.
So why not do it? I think in an ideal world, we buy all our barley from local farmers. There's not enough barley grown in Kintyre to satisfy what we need for a start. So we can't do it, but that which we do buy or we do get the farmers to grow for us deserves to be treated separately because it does contribute to the character and flavour of the whiskey.
And would you consider increasing the amount that you get from farmers then? Is there the scope?
Well, I think we do.
Grow,
Findlay will
or
know
do
a
you
bit
get as
more
much
than
as
me.
you can?
We don't get as much as we can because we're not touching Brexit and all the rest of it, but agricultural diversification has perhaps led some local farmers or more local farmers than previously to get in touch with us and kind of say, well, actually, and that's probably not so much Brexity to be fair, but they've seen the product out there and they're saying, oh, actually, we'd be interested in that. So
yeah, it's something we've explored. We've had conversations with a variety of different farmers in the Campbelltown and Kintyre area. I think it's all contained in the same thing. If we want to make more local barley, we're at a kind of peak of what we can produce at Springbank. We're sort of maxed out in terms of the way we do things and splitting between Glengyle and Springbank. So if we want to do 3-4 extra weeks of local barley, that's going to eat into Longrow, it's going to eat into Hazelburn, it's going to eat into Springbank. It's not something we're against. I think it's just something we need to balance off properly. I don't know if this is a question that's coming up, but the processing of local barley is a totally different beast.
That was maybe a question from me, I think.
Do you want me to go into that just now?
I'll do it.
Because here, when I'm up at the distillery, I've actually been up and had a look at the barley myself and kind of picked it up and had a closer look, and it's not got that kind of uniform grain. There's a few other things going about in there. It's quite interesting. I hear from the production team, that making Longrow, first of all, is one thing that is quite challenging, I think, at times because of it's so heat, it's so hot in the kiln, and they've got to sort of smoke the barley for the long period. But also with local barley, that processing the grain and milling and things like that can be quite challenging. Yeah,
it's difficult from start to finish, and the reason we do it is because we produce something so different, and I think something that's so distinctive and so good that it's worth doing. But When we get our normal barley that's bought in, it comes from a commercial supplier, and it's screened and it's got all of the kind of roots and things taken out of it. It's screened to make sure that it's as uniform as you mentioned as possible, that it malts to a certain standard. There's almost none of that with the things that are grown locally. You get everything that's produced in that field from the farmer. So they do a great job of drying it for us and bring it to us in a condition that means that we can malt it. But you get grain sizes that are massive. You get grain sizes that are absolutely tiny. You get things that are literally just husks in amongst all that.
You get things that aren't barley.
Things that aren't barley. Whether that be stones, whether that be like the actual shaft of the barley plant. All that kind of stuff comes through. So straight off the bat, you're dealing with that. Almost always it's water sensitive, which means that we have to modify the steeping regime. So if we use the same steeping regime that we use for our normal barley, we would pretty much drown it. We'd kill the embryo, in the grain, and we just wouldn't get the malting process. So we have to make sure that we're very careful about how we allow the grain to absorb moisture. But because you've got such a range of grain size, the smaller stuff will invariably drown anyway. Yeah. So you're losing a percentage of your yield straight off the bat from that. Once it's out onto the floor, it's not too dissimilar to work, to be honest, from that side of things. And also in terms of the kilning process doesn't vary massively, but a lot of the weight that you are then putting into the bins and grinding and mashing isn't necessarily fermentable extract that's going to give you whiskey. It's a lot of other stuff. It comes in with a higher protein content as well, so immediately, straight away, the amount of kind of sugars and the alcohol you're going to get is reduced. Yeah. All of that just makes it difficult to work with. Generally speaking, because it's got more protein, it's a little bit more gummy in the mash tun, so it can sometimes be close to setting. It has to be kept a careful eye on. It's just a bugger to work with. In the nicest possible way, it's a bugger to work with, but it produces something that is so distinctive from what we would normally produce that it is worth it. And maybe I can say that from sitting in my cosy office, and the guys who are working with it might disagree, but from a product point of view and from a distillate point of view, you can tell what the difference between a local barley and a normal Springbank.
What would you, and I know year to year, batch to batch will vary, but what is the yield difference?
That was the question. I was like, what was that question I was just going to ask?
Pretty massive. I mean, I won't touch on specifics, but anywhere between kind of 25 to 80 litres of alcohol per tonne less.
I mean, 25 to 80 is enormous. Yeah. When you're dealing with, 400-ish per tonne from commercially sourced barley.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, from my absolutely non-scientific, but having worked here for a long time, 400 litres per tonne, floor malting, the way we do it, the way we mash, all the rest of it, is decent. It's pretty decent. An absolute optimum production process, you're not getting much above that. Maybe 4.8, 4.10, maybe something like that. So we do really well. Our guys do really well to get the yield they get from the barley that we buy in from the east coast of Scotland or whatever. But for the local barley, if we get a good crop, a good yield, to get 25% less than that is massive.
Yeah.
To get 80% less than that it's not even inefficient. It's ridiculous. But as Findlay and Nicole have both said, it is actually worth it. Not just worth it because it supports a local farmer and it keeps the money in the community, and that farmer and his family will spend their money at the butcher and the baker and maybe even the whiskey shop if you're lucky. But that money stays within Campbelltown. But it's worth it because the whiskey is different. And I know the one, this is the first sherried modern local barley that we've done, and the Oloroso is big in this. The influence is definitely there. But you talk about old school Springbanks. I think that this is you've got the Oloroso influence, but you've got the Campbelltown, the funk, hashtag Campbelltown funk. You've got the dirty, earthy, Dunnage warehousey thing here as well. That we call it Dunnage Warehouse, but it might be the Dunnage Warehouse that gives it. It might not be, but it's the most you walk in the Dunnage Warehouse. It smells.
It's a sense of like entire place, like
Filth, mean, horrible, disgusting places you would never want to be unless you were maturing your whiskey in.
but still come to Capleton.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're talking to people who understand that the places you don't want to be in a distillery are the places you do want to be, and that's what you get from some of these whiskies, and it's there in this one. But you're also getting and I found that the local barleys over there that you mentioned, it's like normal Springbank, but Campbelltownier, and that's the worst word in the world. But it's like the brine, the salt, the earthiness is bigger. And as Findlay absolutely rightly says, nothing about the production process influences that. We don't mature them in a different warehouse. We don't fill them into different cask types.
So it must be.
The only difference is the barrel. And there are people out there from distilleries up and down the country and probably even around the world who consider barley as a source of sugar to create alcohol. And I would put these whiskies all day, every day up against that as an argument that place matters, location matters. There's a T word that's a bit French that I don't know how to pronounce, so but and for a company like ours, everything else is done here. So why not get that kind of proportion of barley here as well? As long as it makes good whiskey. If it made a terrible whiskey, why would you bother?
I think
you wouldn't bother.
Yeah.
You wouldn't.
So hence why it's continuing, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. People like it, and we like it, and
And it's got a lovely, lovely, lovely label, which Morton asks, will we keep it the same? And I hope so, because
I know why he's asking, because I told him we might not.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because this is one of two of the old local barley labels.
Well, as long as it's a nice old style like that.
Yeah, but they're the other local barley label.
But then 66.
I'm glad you said that, because I wasn't going to which one was which.
But
But there's another local barley label that's a hand drawing of our stills and our warmed up condenser and stuff, which is another beautiful label. And so when Morton and his pals, the Springbank Stallions, came to visit us last year, and they were like, "Oh, local barley's done," and I was like, "It's not really good. Folks still want to buy it, and we still want to sell it, and it's still good." And I was like, "But maybe we'll change the label." But maybe it turned into no, we won't. So it's going to be the same label.
It's a beautiful label.
Yes,
I mean,
it's my favourite as well.
And I mean, it's hand drawn. Our graphic designer. Were the graphic designers in the 60s? I don't know. The guy who designs all our labels he does it all by hand. It's a phenomenal process. There's no computers involved right up until the point of, right, we need to print this. Can we please use a computer? Because you cannot draw by hand 9,000 labels. He probably would like to, but we're a bit late asking him to start it 9 years ago. So it's hand drawn. It's one guy's imagination, interpretation of what we do, and beautiful.
Yeah, it's
beautiful.
We have one question here which came in from a society member. His name's Jim Hansen. Hello Jim, I'm sure you're watching. And he says, when you're doing a local barley expression, do you contract the farmers to grow the barley way in advance, or do you specify the strain of barley that you want them to grow? I know folks used to rave about golden promise for whiskey making, but I guess climate and yield comes into it. So
yeah, I guess with regards to what's grown, it's a bit of a two-way street. So we have an idea about some of the maybe older heritage varieties we'd like to use, or certain styles, but ultimately the farmers know their land, they know what works best there, what grows, so we'll always consult with them and see what they think will do best in that particular area. So from that point of view, it is generally a balance between the two. I think from our point of view, we like to experiment with as many as we can, just to see what the difference is, and we have done a lot of that in the past.
what varieties have you used off the top of your head?
We've used beer barley, Westminster, organic concerto, or as close to organic concerto as you can get. We've done Prisma, Belgravia. Generally speaking, it tends to be malting varieties that are maybe no longer given that status that we'll look at doing older styles, because as Al mentioned before, it's not a set raw material that just stays the same forever. It
No.
peaks and it drops down and something new comes in. And if you look at the history of the barley varieties that have been used by the whisky industry, it's changing all the time. So we, as we quite often do, look back in time and see what's been used in the past and ask the farmers if they would be willing to grow such things. But as I say, we always lean on their experience as well, because
And what works on their land.
nobody here's an expert on farming.
What do we use at the moment? Like for our not local but general barley, what's our current barley?
The strain we're using just now is Laureate, which is a reasonably new strain. It's a crossbreed of Sanet and Concerto. So for a number of years, Concerto has been certainly for us. The
Optic Concerto.
That's right. Yeah, we've gone Optic, Concerto, and now on to Laureate. I'd say we're an early adopter of Laureate. I think Concerto is still very much used out there, but we felt that the time was right to change and move towards something that's looking like it's going to be the next.
Yeah, well, actually, the farmer did say that as well when I said, do you grow Concertos? Concerto's kind of starting to go off that kind of peak.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I'm an expert in very few things, and barley growing isn't one of them, but I do know that there are, kind of stages of bringing a variety to market, getting its molten status, enjoying a heyday and peak years, starting to drop off, and the next things are coming behind it.
Yeah, the interesting thing for me is absolutely not a man of science in any way, shape or form, but barley for malting purposes apparently has a lifespan of 10 years from, and not from conception to finishing, but from we start using it, 10 years later we will not be using it anymore. But it takes 12 years to identify its replacement.
Right.
So
there's a
2
2-year
years
period
before Laureate became approved for malting, they were working on what would come after Laureate. I mean, that blows my mind.
Yeah, I know, it's incredible.
And the good thing, slight anecdote about local barley, and the farmers knowing their land, and it's absolutely relevant. When we had started asking local farmers to grow barley for us again, and the guys, all of the local farmers take a great interest in what's going to come from that. As is understandable. But I was having a pint or two in the pub one night, and a guy I know who's farmer, who's growing some barley for us, come over. How Ranald, how's it going? Hi, good. How did that barley we grew for you go? Hi, yeah, we did our stuff with it. It was good and stuff. What about the nitrogen? I was a bit worried that there was not enough nitrogen in the soil. I'm like, yeah, Robert. If you were worried, I was not worried because I knew you were thinking about it. Because that's way out of my league. But that's what it should be. It's
they know their stuff.
These guys know their stuff, and and I assume, I don't know for sure, but I assume all the growers, the farmers who grow the barley for us, are a bit invested in it to that extent. Like Robert Miller, who had grown some of the Catadale farm that's been in the last couple of bottlings. Robert had not just invested in, they want to grow barley, they want me to grow barley, they're going to give me money to grow barley. He wanted to think, he whether he knew already or whether he'd gone ahead and researched what the barley needed to be like to give us the best. I mean, how great is that?
Yeah.
How natural is that? This is the guy who's growing the barley that's going to make our spirit. And he's not just like, here, have some barley. He's actually thought about what he's done in it. And that, for me, is the essence of traditional whiskey making. And nice.
I think as well, something we didn't quite touch on before, just to kind of finish off talking about the local barley, is that the growing conditions are not ideal on the west coast of Scotland, and particularly in Kintyre. Ral mentioned that the stuff we use mostly comes from the east coast, which is perfect for growing barley. It's much drier, and you don't have such the extreme rainfalls that we tend to get here. So the challenges that face the local farmers to grow the barley are quite extreme, which is maybe another reason why we don't get everything from here, because as well as maybe driving the production team insane, having to process it all the time, the actual growing process would be extremely difficult.
And so this year, actually, our barley was harvested just in August there at High Rannican Farm, and that was I think he grew Stuart grew beer barley and Westminster barley, but we're going to be distilling with the Westminster barley next year.
Yeah, Stuart Heritage, who has gone for his last couple of years, and a really good source of knowledge about barley growing and farming, and a really helpful guy. The distillery, actually, in general, we quite often borrow his tractor and trailer for moving malt. So, Stuart, if you're watching, thanks very much appreciated. So we'll have a look at that. That's currently sitting in our barley loft just now, and generally speaking, we'll let it run through the winter. It'll tend to go dormant in the cooler temperatures, and we'll wait until the spring, until it's maybe broken its dormancy before we start thinking about processing it. We don't have a huge amount of control over the temperature and stuff in the malting process, so for something like local barley, which I say tends to be water sensitive and be more difficult to break its dormancy, they're a bit more difficult to work with. We want to make sure we're giving it the optimum conditions for it to flourish, so we'll wait until springtime when temperatures start to rise a little bit more to look at that.
And that'll take up a week of your production at Springbank.
Yeah, 1 week. Generally speaking, it's probably 2, maybe even 3 floors. You know, by the time you work with the stuff that isn't barley and isn't going to give you a yield, generally speaking, you probably need about 3 malt floors in order to get 1 week's worth of production.
What is our total production at Springbank for the year? Somebody's probably asked it, but
Litres of alcohol.
Yeah, litres of alcohol at Springbank.
In a non-coronavirus affected year, the last couple before 2020, it's been about 250,000 litres of alcohol, and that's total. That includes long row, Hazelburn, and local barley production, and that, I think you mentioned before, marks an increase over the last 4 years.
That's absolutely double whatever we would used to have talked about. And imagine 250,000 litres of alcohol being twice as much as you made before. Like two times nothing is still nothing. You know, we're running, if not quite flat out, as close to flat out as we're able to go at the moment, and it's 250,000 litres of alcohol. You know, there's other, small independent distilleries are distilling 2, 3, 4 times that. You know, if you're not distilling 750,000 a million litres a year, you don't even register. And yet we're a distillery that has the reputation we have, the following we have, and distilling 250,000 litres, is low, but it allows us to control it. It allows us to do it the way Findlay wants us to do it. It allows us to buy from local farmers. And as I say, that's double what it was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Which is,
So I think for the final dram, we've got a good few questions to go. And this final one that we have is the Springbank 8-year-old matured in a Pedro Ximénez cask. Actually, go back to that. Somebody did ask if we plan to use Palo Cortado casks, or have we?
We have, yeah. We've using a variety of different sherry casks for the last 2 years, give or take. And that ranges from the really light styles, the Finos, the Manzanillas, into the kind of Monteados, Palo Cortados, Oloroso, which is really the main sherry type that we use on site. And also Pedro Ximénez, as we're about to try. And that's between both distilleries and with Cadenhead as well. The guys were trying is it Gontorcas that had been matured in Manzanilla.
Yeah,
so a lot of the drive to get in different sherry types was for us to experiment and play around at Springbank and a little bit at Glengyle, but for a huge part of it was for the Cadenhead side of things, to allow them to maybe put whiskies that were already mature, but they maybe wanted a slightly different characteristic to flourish in it, into these different sherry casks and see how it worked. And it's something that's really interesting to us. I know we're going to come on to it in a bit more detail once we try this and talk about what's coming out the back of this. But in terms of what these different sherry types do in terms of influence of the whiskey and how long and that kind of thing, is something that's really a big interest to me, and I know that Ranald's interested in it as well.
Yeah. So this is the final dram of the evening, and we'll start with a big question from Ruth Ashton Ward. So hello Ruth, I'm sure you're watching tonight as well. I think I've seen your name up in the comments.
I think Ruth has been involved every night.
Yeah.
Hi Ruth. She's got a lot more stamina than me.
So Ruth did ask, where do you source your sherry casks from? One bodega or several? How long on average do you ask the bodegas to season the casks for before we accept them? And does that period of time that you ask them to season for differ depending on the sherry type?
Yeah, well, I said, hi Ruth. I had to actually dig into all of
That
those.
is the most Findlay question. I don't even, in my tendency to dominate the conversation, I have no inclination to get involved in that whatsoever. So,
No, this will allow me to go as long-winded as I go, so thanks for that, Ruth. Very much appreciated. No, it's a really interesting question. I suppose, to take it back and not to focus too much on myself, but a couple of years ago I went over to visit our sherry cask supplier, a guy called Miguel Martin. I was doing a bit of a tour of both Portugal and Spain, and I was maybe hoping to catch him for half an hour to chat to him, and he was nice enough to spend almost an entire, I think it was about 12 hours he spent in total. Got me picked up in the morning from a hotel, right the way through to a meal in the evening, talking just about sherry, about the process, seasoning, his operation, how it works with whiskey, all that kind of stuff. Really knowledgeable guy, really nice guy, and I learned a lot from chatting to him. So in terms of who we buy from, it's Miguel Martin for our sherry casks. As I touched on before, predominantly we buy Oloroso sherry casks. So for those casks, they are made using Spanish oak. So the Spanish oak has much higher tannin content, but it's also a lot more difficult to work with and harvest, a bit like the local barley in a lot of ways. So it doesn't grow straight and as tall as the American oak. They get a lot lower yield from it. But even when they cut the staves, they have to reject about 30% of the staves that they cut, just because the grain doesn't always go right the way across. It would allow permeation if you were to use it. As I say, the tannin content is absolutely massive. When they took me to see where the staves had been cut, I was looking at a pile, and it looked like there'd been an area that had been really tarred underneath it. There was this black area beneath the staves. And I just asked Miguel, I said, "Oh, what's happened there?" He said, "No, that's part of the seasoning process. We leave it outside, the rain comes down and actually washes out a lot of the tannins. The tannin content's so high that they need a lot of it to drop out even before they put it into the cask making process." So I chatted to Miguel and I asked him almost this exact question. What is the seasoning time? Why is it that way? And in terms of Oloroso, it's about 15 months. So he was saying they did a huge study a few years ago that lasted about 4 years into the spirit type, climate, areas in a warehouse, all that kind of stuff. And they found that 15 months for Oloroso sherry to be ideally matured in a Scotch whisky warehouse environment was what they were aiming for. He said most of the sherry itself penetrates within about 12 months. And the first thing that it removes from the wood are kind of harsh tannins, the things that you maybe wouldn't want coming through in your whiskey. So the longer you leave that Oloroso in contact with that new Spanish oak, the more it's actually going to extract the kind of softer, more pleasant tannins that you want. So they cap it at about 15 months. They'll empty it. I'll email Miguel and say, we're looking for 216 Oloroso casks, which is a lorry load. They'll empty it that week, ship it over to us, and it's generally within a month, between them emptying, us getting it and filling it. So incredibly fresh and gives us fantastic results. Pedro Jimenez, very similar, Spanish oak. I think it's done in a very similar way to Oloroso. As Ruth mentioned, there are other sherry types in there that are generally a bit more subtle, a bit softer. For them, they use American oak to make the casks because they feel that the tannins completely overpower the delicate nature of the sherry that's been shipped across. So there's a little bit of sherry left in the cask when it comes across to us, and it obviously permeates the staves as well. So they use American oak just to reduce that tannin content. And what they said to us was, when I first asked about Manzanilla, Palo Cortado, Amontillado, and Fino, he said that they're much softer sherries. They're going to give you a slower influence on the whiskey, and they're maybe not ideally suited to the Scotch whiskey warehousing environment. Whereas actually what we found, certainly in the last 2 years, and certainly for whiskies that we've already partially matured and then given an extra couple of years, they've had a huge influence and a really kind of promising and different influence than we would get from Oloroso, which, as I say, is the one we use most often.
So that was a good question to start with. Let's see what we have here. Someone did ask a wee bit about the Duncan Myers Briggs. asked that he regularly gets a kind of sulphur flavour coming through in some sherry maturations that he tries, but not in other maturations, or sometimes with wines as well, but not in bourbon or rum. And he's wondering where that might come from. Is it a reaction between the spirit and the cask? But he's heard of sulphur candles being used, but doesn't think that's the cause. But he's heard rumours of it. So he could maybe just settle his query and his the quandaries on here when it comes to things like that.
Yeah, I think in terms of this phenomenon or when it's occurred, it seems to me from the research I've done to be primarily an 80s and 90s thing. I'm not saying it's entirely specific to there and it hasn't approached other generations, but in the 80s and 90s it seems to have been a technique, as you mentioned, to use these sulphur candles to almost sterilise the casks because they were having long periods of sitting empty and a reasonably long transport period. They would want to sterilise the cask as much as possible, and the sulphur candles achieved this, but they also imparted this sulphur characteristic onto the casks. So, as I say, without being an expert on the matter, when the rules changed between sherry being able to be shipped across in cask and it only being able to come across in bottle, what tended to happen was the sherry casks were emptied and they would maybe sit there for an extended period of time and they would spoil and they would sour if something wasn't done to them. So the solution seems to have been to use these candles to sterilise them. That's imparted a kind of sulphury characteristic into the casks, and it seems to vary by degree. We talked about it a little bit earlier. Everyone's got a slightly different threshold for tasting sulphur, so some people cannot abide even the tiniest hint of it. Other folk, it can be at a reasonably high level and they don't really notice it. As I mentioned before in the answer to the previous question, the way sherry casks are seasoned now and how quickly we get them, it eliminates the need for anything like that. In the more recent Springbanks that have been in sherry casks or other whiskies that have been in sherry casks that we've tried, you don't even get a hint of that, but it's definitely in some of the casks that have been around in the 90s or even refill casks that have been reused again in the 2000s. There's definitely a little bit of an influence.
So that was good as well. And from Soren Anker Nielsen, we have a question which is about sort of maturation as well, and these kind of nice rich maturations. So in the past we've done our Rundlets and Kilderkins editions. Actually, we did it for Hazelburn, Longo and Springbank. It's a lovely bottle. David Allen, you're missing a bottle from your office, I'm going to tell you.
And it's not going back.
It's not going to see the night out.
I pinched that earlier today. Soren was wondering if we have any Rundlet and Kilderkin, Kiln or Octave maturations in the pipeline. So nice. They're smaller casks.
Yeah, smaller casks. So generally speaking, a quicker influence, a bigger influence, a faster maturation, if you want to call it that. Out the back of that, you end up with huge maturation losses, and it's something that needs to be kept an eye on fairly carefully. It isn't something that we're actively doing at the moment, Ranald. I think you would confirm that as much as I can. Given how good the Rundlets and Kilderkin but the bottlings were, I wouldn't be against doing it. I think it's just about picking the moment to do it, finding the right casks, having an idea about when we wanted to bottle it and what it would look like. From my point of view, the bar has been set so high with these bottlings that if you're going to do it again, you've got to do it right. So I think that's the kind of thing we would need to consider before we did it again.
You wouldn't want to do a 1 year, 18 months, whatever finish in these wee casks. Now, you wouldn't do a full term maturation in them because you'd have nothing left. Yeah. But you want to strike the balance that struck, because that's an awesome Springbank. It's great. It's a beautiful whiskey. The long row from Rundlets and Kilderkins, amongst the long row fans, love it. Great. The Hazelburn Rundlets and Kilderkins, amongst people who are not Hazelburn fans but who want their Hazelburn to taste like Springbank, absolutely brilliant. So massively positive influence from these casks. And yeah, we will suffer the maturation losses to a degree, because again, you're trying not to lose money when you produce whiskey and stuff. But yeah, we need to do it right, and we need to be confident that the quality of these small casks is as good as it was with them.
Mhm.
And will we use that shiny sticker on the label again? I'd like to.
Yeah, I like it.
I like it. I think it looks nice.
I think it looks
I think
awesome,
it's a nice presentation. But there's 15, 16, 18 people in our bottling hall who
So how
hope
do
we
they
never
have to,
do it again.
Do
Oh,
you have to
hand.
like glue everyone and
Yeah.
stick on
Well,
the
they
hand?
were sticky back,
Right.
but it had to be hand applied.
Uh-huh.
And it's great. We're a hands-on company. We love people. We love production. All the rest of it. But
But
you
the people
you also
don't
don't want folk to go on strike. If you can avoid it. But
I'll queue them off the store if we do that.
yeah, I mean, it's great. It looks lovely, and the whiskey inside it's great. And if we can recreate the whiskey, then yeah, one day of course we will.
Talking about we're nearing the end of the year, and someone was asking if Tom Wan was asking if we would be thinking about releasing another society bottling anytime soon or before the end of the year, perhaps. Are any of the cask samples that we've tried through our Malts Festival earmarked, if you like, for future society bottlings, or
No. We'll be doing another society bottle, not this side of Christmas, because we had 3 whiskies coming out today. We've got another couple coming out in 3 weeks' time. There's we had our festival releases, so we're not going to put a society bottle out this side of Christmas, but into January, February, we would intend to have a society bottle coming, which is.
in fact that kind of leads on. No, it doesn't really, but someone did put a wee message in just as we were finishing talking about the local barley and going on to the next dram. Stephen Anderson asked, would we or have we any plans, or maybe would we consider in the future doing a local barley with Longrow or hazel burns with it? Is that?
I mean, it kind of all relates back to the limitations of production that we touched upon before. We're at the maximum we can do in terms of how we're structured just now. So any additional experimentation, changes to the composition of how much we produce a Longrow or hazelburn is having a knock-on effect on local barley, Springbank. You can go longer in the year at Springbank and then you're eating into Glengyle. So nothing's off the table, I wouldn't say. We're always having discussions about things, but it would need to be systematically planned in.
So, however, no. I think from an idealistic perspective, which is how I approach most things, but the Springbank for me is closest to the heart of what we've produced over the years. Springbank is our distillery. It's our characteristic. Longrow is our peated version. Hazelburn's our unpeated triple distilled version. But the Springbank New Make Spirit is the heart of what we make. And so if you're going right into the heart of what you make, the heart of where you get it from, then the local barley absolutely contributes to that. And yeah, we can make local barley Longrow, local barley Hazelburn, and it would definitely be interesting to see what it tastes like. But in terms of the reason for doing it, the reason to do it is to make your most natural spirit in the most natural way. So Springbank and local barley is more in line with what we're trying to do than with using the others.
And one that's quite relevant to now, as I'm sure most of you know that are watching at home, the distillery did close back in March and reopened at the end of July, beginning of August, due to the pandemic. Someone on Instagram was asking us how has, or perhaps it hasn't, but has COVID affected the business at all?
I guess it's a two-pronged question. I can cover the production side of it. As Nicole said, we shut down when Boris made the announcement. We ran down everything as safely as we could, made sure that everything was sealed up, clean, safe, shut the doors, and it was 4 months later before we were anywhere near the distillery to produce anything. So we lost 4 months production, maybe a little bit more. In terms of what it's meant since we've opened up, there are certain aspects of our production that lend themselves to the current social distancing, small team bubble environment. So our production in the distillery and the malting is perfect for that. You know, the guys are already pretty much working separately if they were mashman or stillman or on one of the malt floors. It was just a case of making sure that there was facilities for hand washing and masks and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of what we do in terms of actually making whiskey was kind of already socially distanced and met the criteria. The stuff that's been more difficult has been office working and particularly the bottling hall. As Ranald mentioned, you know, we've got 15 employees, I think, within the bottling hall that all worked at the same time in the same small space. So we've had to switch to a shift pattern. We've really had to get quite lean. We've had to make sure that the two teams are separated. We've had to put a lot of safety precautions in terms of hand sanitisation, perspex around desks, changes to how people do everything from coming into an office to going to the toilet. So yeah, we've been hugely affected there, and I know that on the kind of office sales shop side, it's been the same.
Yeah, it's not been a normal year at all. The 4 months off that we had in production is reflected in the 4 months off that we had pretty much across the board. You know, we didn't, as a company, we didn't look for ways to make people work. We took the view that from I think it was the 23rd, in fact I know it was the 23rd of March because it was my mum's birthday, but 23rd of March it was announced UK is going into lockdown. So that was it from the 24th. We didn't decide, well, lockdown means this, how are we going to interpret that? It was lockdown means lockdown. If it's safest for the staff to be at home, the staff will be at home. The government are contributing 80% of their wages. We're making sure that we top up the 20%. So everybody who was furloughed for 4 months, which was pretty much everybody except maybe me and Findlay and Linda and Neil, a couple of them. We furloughed, if we employ 80 people, we furloughed 75 of them, put it that way. And yes, of course it's had an effect. You know, we couldn't send whiskey out from Campbelltown from the 23rd of March until pretty much the 1st of August. You know, it's a long time.
Yeah.
And that's a huge hole in our turnover as a business and all the rest of it. But it was the right thing to do. And, you know, in an ongoing basis, we created a 4-month hole in supply that was already fairly short supplied, which I know people are thinking, oh, you know, Springbank 10 comes in and gets bought, it gets sold, and 15 comes in. That will even out over time because we were running tight on supply, but there was enough roughly stuff. But when you've had a 4-month gap in, it's not production, but it's in distribution. But I don't know about anybody else, but alcohol consumption in my house didn't go down
I think
during lockdown.
from what I've heard, across all of the world, it was the same.
Yeah. So people were buying more Springbank than ever before, and we weren't filling the shelves with it. So it's taken a bit of time to try and refill the pipeline, I suppose.
And it's actually quite apt because today, you know, all of these questions we've answered tonight have come from the question sort of boxes on our Facebook and our Instagram and our social feeds. And a lot of the questions that were coming in were questions I didn't really kind of think were appropriate to ask Ranald and Findlay tonight because they were very targeted. You know, it was about the US market or the New Zealand market or where else? Different places anyway, particularly because people are wondering where they can get our whiskies. You know, they think that we no longer supply Norway. That was another one. And it's like, no, it's just because you have to understand that we haven't been sending any whiskey out to our distributors for the last 4 months. But I can assure you it's on a boat now or it's there, you know. So it's on the way. You know, we haven't stopped supplying these markets. It's just that because of the pandemic, things stopped. And we're getting on top of that now, but I'm sure you'll see it soon, so don't worry.
Good point. I mean, that's the thing. Anything that happens in Campbelltown has a knock-on effect and a lead time to the rest of the world. And the method, I'm not going to get into this too far, but the method of distributing whiskey, you know, we like it, we bottle it. Getting it onto a shelf so that someone can buy it, it's a complicated process. It's more complicated than you would ever think it was unless you're involved with it. But things like, you know, a pandemic, it's plays havoc with that.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to coordinate release dates for Kilkenny 16, Springbank 12. It doesn't happen by magic. There's a lot of variable factors that go into that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the fact that we've got back to work, we've coordinated it to an extent that we can get whiskey getting out there
Mm-hmm.
is, we're fairly pleased that we've managed that,
Yeah.
We could have kept going during the 4 months, as a lot of distilleries did, but in a small community like Campbelltown, do you want to encourage anything that might spread something that people don't get? No, you don't. So it's safer to not do that. But we've been back at it since July, August.
But crucially, we've been back at it, but our visitor experience is still
Zero.
so there isn't, and that leads me on actually to, I think, probably a good question to round everything up, which would be, when is it possible to visit the distillery again? And that came in from Dario on Instagram yesterday or earlier today, because we have, although we have restarted as a sort of sales team and introduction to be able to get the whiskey out to you all over the world, again, things are not back to normal, so we don't want to actively encourage people to come to Campbelltown. So the visitor experience is still closed. I don't know if it's possible to give an idea of when that might reopen yet.
I could phone COVID and ask him, but it's Friday night, so he's in the pub. But we I think, to generalise to an extent, but the biggest thing that sets Springbank and Kilkerran and Cannonheads apart is not just that we tell folk we do it differently, but if people come and visit, they will see and feel that it's different. So the biggest thing we want to do is bring people here. Come and see us, because then you'll believe what we've all spoken about tonight. But come and see it, and you'll see it. We're not exaggerating. We're not over-egging the pudding.
No, it's true.
We're not lying. We're not marketing this.
I came to visit you for an interview. Findlay took me on a tour. First time I'd met you. And I remember going around the distillery, and I was just like, oh my gosh, this place is awesome. I think I said that when I saw the still. And within 24 hours, I was like, I'm relocating to Campbelltown.
But before we'd even offered you the job. But that's the thing. It's like, you come and see us and you understand us more than we could ever explain it. So we want people to come to us all the time, because it impresses upon everybody the way we do it, the time we take to do it, the quality of what we produce. But we are, fair to say, the biggest attraction of visitors in Campbelltown. We've got 3 distilleries in Campbelltown, Springbank, Glengyle, Red Scotia, all of which bring in people who want to come and see us. But when you're in a remote part of the country and people are reluctant to travel, and we don't want to be people that are encouraging people to travel around the world, around the country, if it's not safe to do so. So we don't have a visitor facility at the moment. When will we do it again? Well, as soon as it's safe to do it. We're not going to do it before it's safe to do it, because not only are you exposing your visitors to risk, you're exposing the staff to risk, because you walk into the malt barns and you might see the 2 guys who are turning the floor. You walk into the still house and you meet the 2 guys that are distilling. So if you can't offer the proper experience, we'd rather not offer an experience just to get your money off you. Our tour normally costs a tenner. But come and see us for half an hour, we'll take a £5 off you, but you'll not really understand what we're doing. That's not it. So we won't open our doors properly to people until it's safe to do so.
Mirka in the Czech Republic, hello Mirka, is asking if we might consider doing virtual distillery tours. And I know that as a sales team, that is something we've actually talked about. Probably less so like a sort of, but just to sort of invite you in and see around. I'm sure that is definitely something that we'll look at doing. So that might be on the cards, and I'm sure we'll have that all over our social medias and things like that with the help of Nathan here. I think last but not least, it's just really to say, unless there's anything else that...
Well, the other thing I was going to mention is people might be wondering why we've put 8-year-old whiskey in PX. as I mentioned before, we've bought a lot of different sherry cask types, and something we're keen to do is to experiment. So one of the things that we did when we were able to get a hold of these whiskies was to do a lot of feedbacking and have an idea about maybe, showcasing what Springbank is like with the influence of different sherry types. So I know that historically Ranald's been relatively reticent to go near PX just because it is so big and sweet and bold that it might dominate the spirit. But we decided to experiment, and we've put this whiskey into PX, and the plan is over the next few years to do a succession of 10-year-old Springbanks that have had varying years in a second maturation in different sherry types. So PX being the biggest and the boldest, we're going to start with that, and then we'll go in from the sherry types from there. So as we touched upon before, we like to keep an eye on everything that we're making, how it's maturing. So this was really our opportunity to say to you guys, here's this whiskey, 8 years old. It's been in PX for
18 months.
18 months, thank you. 18 months. What do you think of it? We're going to keep watching it. If we think it's starting to get a little bit too PXy, we might take it back into bourbon. But over the next few years, we're going to release a number of Springbanks at the 10-year-old age statement that have had varying degrees of maturation in different sherry types. And this is much a learning experience for us as it is for you guys. We hope that you'll give us a lot of feedback, as you always do. But I'm really excited to see how this goes. This is over 5 years, so I'll be hitting a big birthday by the time we finish it. But yeah, really exciting.
Yeah, that's the thing. As Findlay says, we're we're planning to do in 2 years' time. We're going to do 10-year-old Springbank PX. Did I say 10 years' time? 2 years' time.
Yeah.
2 years' time. Springbank 10-year-old PX. Year after that, it'll be Springbank 10-year-old in Palo Cortado.
Mm-hmm.
Year after that, it'll be Springbank 10-year-old in Amontillado, Manzanilla. Sorry,
Fino then
Manzanilla. So we're going to do this as our kind of special release every year. We've got 5 years worth of Springbank sherry finished, and as Findlay says, the PX will be a 2-year finish-ish. Yes, no, maybe, kind of.
Roughly, depending on...
Yeah, depending. So, and then the Palo Cortado will be a year extra. Yes, maybe, kind of. Then the other ones that we've also spoken about that I've forgotten the order. But so we're going to do, in addition to our core products, our special release for 5 years will be PX, Palo Cortado, Manzanilla, Fino, Amontillado. So you'll get the full exposure to Springbank in all these different sherry types, and not only will it's not a new thing for you, everybody who's watching, everybody who's buying it, everybody who's drinking it. It's new for us as well, because we've not used PX for Springbank forever. Palo Cortado hadn't heard of it till Findlay went to Jerez and learned about it. We'd used Manzanilla, Fino, and Amontillado sporadically, but we hadn't.
And to have
really
a sort
had
of
a
year
plan.
after year as a sort of direct comparison would be really interesting.
And it is as interesting for us as it is for everybody else, because we don't know what it's going to do. If it's terrible, we're not going to bottle it, but it won't be terrible because right back to the start, it's good spirit into good quality casks.
So as long as you're keeping an eye on the casks, tasting them.
Yeah, this falls into the category we talked about before. Something new, small scale, reasonably experimental. We will be on top of this all the time. And it's not just an excuse to continually drink loads and loads of whiskey. It's a learning process.
It sounds like we're making the whiskey for us.
Yeah, if we like it, why shouldn't anyone else like it? We're not weird, we're not different, we're not that unusual. So, why not?
So yeah, anything else?
No, I mean, I would just like to say,
Burning?
I've been tuned into every single tasting this week. I think all the guys have done a great job. I've really enjoyed looking at the feedback from all of you guys watching it as well. I think it's been a great success. I've enjoyed tonight personally. I hope you guys have got a lot out of it as well. And just, thanks very much to everybody involved in putting this together, because I think in terms of the circumstances we're in, this is one of the best things that could have come out the back of it. And from on a personal level, I've loved it. Both on both sides of the camera.
Yeah.
I know that's it. I mean, we like nothing more than welcoming people to Campbelltown. As I said, you come see it, you understand it, you believe it, you see what we're doing, you build relationships, you talk to people, everybody loves it that little bit more after they've been here. You can't come here, we can't open the doors, but this is as close as we can get to it. We've shared over the course of a week, over the course of tonight, we share some great drams. Over the course of the week, we share some brilliant drams, and it's there is a lot of work goes into it. There's a lot of planning goes into it, a lot of coordination goes into it. Hopefully, it's worked as well for everybody as we feel it's worked for us. There's not been a disaster. Give it a couple of minutes, 30 seconds of maybe, but no, it's gone great. Hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.
And we would have loved to take you into the wee houses and into the distillery and everything, but sadly the Wi-Fi just doesn't doesn't let us.
No, we had all kinds of ideas of how we were going to do this, and we might do it. But then we also went back to actually what is Janie Mitchell? What is Springbank? It's whiskey. It's the people who make it and deal with it and talk about it. And if we've passed that across over 5 nights, and you've been here for all 5 nights, well, good on you, because I didn't even manage 5. I took a night off in the middle. But no, good. What a showcase of the best that we can offer. Not in a day, but in a week. This is the best that we can offer. And if you like it, good. If you didn't like it, fine. But from one company and one group of people, I won't try and name everybody because I may offend somebody by forgetting. But I think he's been mentioned every night.
Nathan.
But
I was just going to.
We're all pointing at me. You can't see him. But Nathan has had, a lot of responsibility thrust upon him this week. Mary Patterson behind the scenes in the organisation, Lauren, Bethany and the dispatch, and everybody you've seen on camera this week and stuff. And it's
been a hands-on.
Yeah, it's been hands-on, but that's how it should be. That's us. That's us. And it didn't just happen this week. It took some planning, some thinking, some talking, some organisation. The guys in Bottling Hall who bought the whiskey for us, the people who weren't just me or Findlay or Nicole involved in putting the whiskies together, whether it was a Springbank or a Cadenheads or a Kilkenny. It's been a massive effort. Will we do it again? As long as you didn't hate it, we may well do it again. Because who knows when we're going to be able to open the doors and welcome you all back. But hopefully, at our festival this week, or Tuesday to Friday that we do every year until this year, it's the highlight of our year, because getting you guys here and talking to you guys and meeting you guys and having a drink with you and all the rest of it, it's unparalleled. You can't repeat that without specifically doing it, but we're trying to convey as much of that this week as we can, and so hopefully we've done a bit of it for everybody.
So I think that basically rounds up everything I had written down in here. So it concludes the online or the virtual Malts Festival for 2020, and I'm sure, like we said, we're all looking forward to having you here in person sometime. When that will be, we don't know. And it's been a huge team effort. So lots of really nice comments coming up on the comments section just now, saying that you've enjoyed it. So thanks for taking part. We have all enjoyed it as well. I've enjoyed it. It's been good fun. And I'm looking forward to doing it in person though. Can't wait for that. That'll be even better, I'm sure. So thanks for joining, and we hope to get your feedback. Actually, that would be quite valuable, to get your feedback for developing future events online like this one. So I'm sure you can send that in all the different channels that's possible. So there we go. Slange, thanks very much.
Thanks all.
Cheers. Thanks, folks.